First off, I would like to welcome you to our conference. Our session today is kind of a mixed one from the point of view of the topics covered. We can't just we have two presentations which will deal with subjective well-being, one on trust and one on crime. So I think nevertheless it would be interesting for all of us. We have 4 presenters, as I said, and I would kindly ask all presenters to try to keep their presentations within the expected time limitations. We agreed it would be 15 minutes. If we do that, we'll have enough time for questions and possible comments, and I think it would be very interesting and productive. Our first presenter is Zuzanna Brunarska, she would tell us who is the co-author, and she is from the University of Warsaw in Poland. And now the floor is yours, Zuzanna.
Thank you. Hi, everyone again. May I share my screen because I cannot see? Okay, let's check it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
And is it visible in a full screen mode or not yet?
It's visible in the full screen. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm very happy to be able to present our research at another RLMS user conference. It is a co-authored paper with Sabina Toruńczyk-Ruiz, also from University of Warsaw, and it examines the relationship between ethnic diversity and outgroup trust, that is, trust in people of different ethnicity, differentiating between 2 types of ethnic diversity, the long-standing and recent ethnic diversity. And the relationship between ethnic diversity and social trust in general is usually analyzed with reference to 2 competing theoretical approaches: theories of group threat and conflict theory and contact hypothesis. According to the first group of theories, the presence of an outgroup triggers actual or perceived competition over the scarce resources such as jobs, housing, or power, which triggers feelings of group threat. The second approach states that intergroup contact improves attitudes towards outgroup members. And previous empirical research on the relation between ethnic diversity and outgroup trust specifically has reported mixed findings. And one possible explanation for that, in our view, is that it has been conducted in a range of geographical contexts in which ethnic diversity has different roots. So in some, it stems from recent immigration, while in others from historical coexistence of established ethnic groups. And if you look into the examples of studies that I listed here, it actually seems that it may partly be also the question of conceptualization and the concomitant operationalization. Namely, it seems that a negative relation was reported when ethnic diversity was expressed in terms of the presence of immigrants, for instance, measured by an immigration rate, while a positive relation was recorded when diversity measure was based on a longer list of ethnic groups, including established and recent ones, and native ones. And there were also studies that went beyond simply stating whether the relationship is positive or negative, and they pointed to the role of additional factors, for instance, direct contact between members of specific groups or segregation. But overall, we argue that considering the nature of diversity in a given context is crucial for an understanding of its relation to outgroup trust. And 2 works so far has touched upon this issue and addressed the question of how past exposure to ethnic diversity affects reaction to current diversity. Gundelach suggested that the relationship between current ethnic diversity and outgroup trust depends on whether the diversity is static or dynamic. And she showed that the positive effect of current ethnic diversity disappears in countries with greater share of immigrants and with their greater increase in the last years. And second study by Mikhail showed that the effect of present-day immigration rate on generalized trust was more negative in countries that had above average share of foreign-borns at different time points in the past. So different approaches, also different results. And in this paper, we propose a different conceptual and methodological approach. We try to operationalize two qualitatively distinct types of ethnic diversity. We conceptualize long-standing diversity as that arising from historical coexistence of certain ethnic groups in a given territory, and recent diversity as that generated by groups that have arrived only recently. And in our approach, we just focus on continuity of coexistence of specific ethnic groups, assuming that people get used to an ethnic group's presence in their surroundings, so that there might be a kind of habituation mechanism at play. And in Russia, we've got both the native ethnic diversity and recent immigration, and that it provides a relevant context to compare the outcomes, the potential outcomes of the two types of ethnic diversity. And we pose two research hypotheses in line with what I already said. So the first one stating that recent ethnic diversity is negatively related to outgroup trust, as it is interpreted as a source of group competition and threat. And the second one stating that long-standing ethnic diversity is positively related to outgroup trust, as it provides more opportunities for interethnic contact and generally is less threatening. And we use data coming from the 24th RLMS round combined with population census and registration data. We control for a range of variables in our models and that you've got listed here on the slide. And given the nature of our dependent variable, which was measured on a 1:4 scale, and the hierarchical nature of the data, we estimate a three-level random intercept ordered logistic regression model, accounting for missing data by means of multiple data imputation. And we conduct most of our analysis on federal subject level, complementing it with models for the municipal level, wherever data for municipalities were accessible. And as regards our measures of ethnic diversity, we run our models for several different measures. And our main measure of long-standing ethnic diversity was based on a comparison of 1989 and 2010 population census data and rests on a distinction into established and recent groups. While it's easy to categorize, for instance, ethnic Russians or members of indigenous ethnic groups as established, old diasporic minorities such as Ukrainians or Armenians make up both the long-standing and recent diversity, and that's why we decided that it's important to split their group size into two subgroups, established and recent. And by default, we treated the whole ethnic group as established, and only in the case of ethnic groups originating from top countries sending most migrants to Russia, we split the group size into those two subgroups, established and recent. And we did it this way, that we assumed that the size of a given ethnic group as of 1989 would reflect how large is the established part of an ethnic group, while we assumed that the change in the size of a given ethnic group that occurred between the two time points reflects the proportion of a group as recorded in 2010 census that is composed of established groups. So the change is composed of recent immigrants, of course. And our main measure of long-standing diversity took the form of an ethnic fractionalization index, and it was constructed this way, that we meant to include only those groups and parts of groups denoted as established, while ignoring all those parts of groups denoted as recent immigrants. Okay, and so apart from this measure, we also used measures that relied on past censuses from the Soviet times, and also a simple ethnic fractionalization index for current diversity based on 2010 census in order to compare the effect for federal subject and for municipalities for which we had no historical data. As regards recent ethnic diversity, we measured it by an immigration rate to reflect the current migration inflow. by the change in the ethnic diversity between 1989 and 2010, measured by a difference in the ethnic fractionalization indices, by a recent change in the share of foreign-born, and finally by the, again, by a refined census-based measure, which was again based on the same distinction into established and recent, and based on the same comparison of 1989 and 2010 census, but this time these were those recent parts that loaded on the index next to one broad category that included all the established groups in established parts of groups, so all those that are not the source of recent immigration. And now the results showed that the long-standing ethnic diversity was positively related to outgroup trust, irrespective of the measure used. And in case of the current ethnic diversity, both for the municipal and federal subject level. And in case of recent ethnic diversity, immigration rate was negatively related to outgroup trust, both for the municipal and the federal subject levels. And so were the changes in the ethnic diversity between 1989 and 2010, and also the change in the share of foreign-born between 2002 and 2010, while the last census-based measure was not significant. And the picture here summarizes our results. It shows a clear pattern, so the positive effect of long-standing ethnic diversity and the negative effect of recent diversity. And it also suggests that the effect of long-standing diversity is stronger than the negative effect of recent diversity. And so our findings that show that diversity driven by recent immigration tends to dampen trust in people of different ethnicity, while diversity based on historical coexistence of different ethnic groups seem to have a trust-breeding potential. So overall, the findings suggest that living in a region with a history of coexistence of various ethnic groups can foster trust in ethnic outgroup members, which would be an optimistic finding. But then a question occurs whether it's really the temporal aspect that matters. So is it really just the time that passes and then people get used to it, to each other, or are there any other factors that interfere into this relationship? And as regards the underlying mechanism, apart from contact between specific groups or habituation, we can think about the potentially moderating role of policies towards immigrants and minorities, and of ethnic hierarchies. So ethnic groups that have greater rights or are higher in the ethnic hierarchy are generally expected to be more trusted. And this may concern ethnic Russians, but also members of titular ethnic groups, but among established populations, but also certain ethnic groups among immigrant populations. And also, perhaps, also we think that the level of integration of different immigrant ethnic groups may moderate the effect of ethnic diversity on trust. And it should be also borne in mind that in Russia, the long-standing ethnic diversity largely boils down to the coexistence of autochthonous minorities with a majority group whose members arrived to the given areas later, but have gained a higher political status. So the question remains whether the positive relationship between long-standing ethnic diversity and outgroup trust would hold in a context in which native majority group coexists with settled migrant groups who had always have a lower political status than the native population. And what we are doing now, we are running a series of robustness checks and additional tests to uncover a bit what might stand behind our results. And to address the role of policies, we tried to compare the role of presence of titular versus non-titular established ethnic groups. And it seems that these are the titular groups that matter, which would mean that this is not about time, but also, or rather, about policies or ethnic hierarchies. But on the other hand, here the RLMS data limitations come to sight, namely, if we just taken the percentages, so the percentage of titular groups versus the percentage of non-titular established ethnic groups in the region. And then it turns out that the first variable actually takes the non-zero values only for those 5 republics that we've got in a sample, while out of all those 38 primary sampling units, which is of course a limitation. And we also tried to test this, test the presence of established versus recent groups for specific ethnic groups in a way to control for the cultural factor. So we did it for titular nationalities originating from Central Asian states, for each of them separately and all of them together. But these analyses weren't very successful. I mean, they didn't bring us any closer to answering the question, what might stand behind the results? Is it time, or are those interfering factors that we're thinking about? So what I might finish with is actually the question whether anybody of you have an idea how we can perhaps shed more light on the factors that may contribute to such a patterns of result. And I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to have your questions and comments.
Thank you, Zuzanna. Time was perfect. Thank you very much. Colleagues, questions? Who have any questions? Yes, Vladimir, please. Gimpelson.
Yeah. Zuzanna, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I would love to listen it in more detail and at full length. I have two questions. First question, can you tell more about your dependent variable? What is that? And second question is, when you talk about migration, what kind of migration do you mean? Long-term migration, when migrants become part of the permanent population, and this migration can be captured by RLMS and by censuses, or short-term labor migration, when these migrants are out of censuses and actually are out of the RLMS. Probably there is some correlation between these two, but this is what we can just speculate. So these are two of my questions. These are my questions.
Thank you. Zuzanna?
Should I answer straight away, or
yes,
are we gathering more?
Sure.
Okay, so I will start with the second one. Well, actually, it would be more desirable to have both the long-term and short-term, I mean, the labor migration in the data. But of course, that's just impossible. And what we did here, like, if we base if our variables were based on the census, then naturally we can hardly reach people like labor migrants, right? So these were those measures like the difference in the between two ethnic fractionalization indices or the share of foreign born. So these were actually not capturing those labor migrants. And the measure, the immigration rate, it may partly capture also labor migrants, especially that it was taken from the 2015. So then already also migrants who registered for at least 9 months are captured in this data. But this is of course also not a perfect measure, as it relates to flows and not to stocks, while it will be more desirable to have stocks, of course, here. But as far as I know, it's not so easy. I mean, the usual data that Rostat, for example, publishes concerns flows and not stocks. And yes, so what we've got, the immigration rate captures both, but imperfectly. And that would be the answer. But a desirable state, it would be to have both. And as regards the dependent variable, I'm just looking for the paper how exactly the question was formulated, but it was the 24th round, so there was an additional block of questions on ethnic and migration issues. And our dependent variables, so outgroup trust, was measured. This was a matrix question on the degree of trust in several different groups of people. And one of those position one of those groups. These are people of different ethnicities. So the question was as follows. It was, one can trust different people to different degrees, and how much do you trust each of the following groups of people? And then there was a list of groups, and one of this position, this was a people of other ethnicity, and we've taken this variable. It was given on a 4-point scale, and we recorded the answers. So because it was coded, then 1 stood for trust all and 4 for trust nobody, and we wanted to have it reversed. So we just used this variable, and given that it was measured on a 4-point scale, we decided to go for ordered regression. Yes. I hope that I managed to answer your question.
Pavel, do you have questions?
Yes, I have a question actually, and I'm wondering whether you estimated it also by age, by different ages, because the question is if diversity, which is historically rooted, has a positive effect on trust, while recent diversity has a negative effect, perhaps it also works on individual level. So if somebody was exposed in the early childhood to diversity, maybe he will be more tolerant than somebody who most of his life, let's say, was living in a homogeneous, among homogeneous population, only, in the recent years was exposed to diversity.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Well, we just controlled age in our model, but you're right that might be an interesting point to check. But on the other hand, I also think that outgroup trust may be subject to intergenerational transmission in a way. So if, let's say, your family was living in a region with this historical coexistence with outgroup members, and then you are brought up in this family, then perhaps your trust towards outgroup members would be influenced by attitudes of your parents, I guess.
Vladimir, I see your finger, and then Elena. Yes.
Yeah, I would just to follow Pavel's question. Probably this would make sense to look not just by age, but by cohorts, by years of birth.
Yeah, I thought that probably not age as a continuous variable, but rather like in cohorts or generations. Yeah.
Elena, you have a question, please. Лена?
Да, спасибо большое. Извините, я его задам по-русски. Я надеюсь, меня переведут.
Конечно.
Зузанна, спасибо вам огромное за интересный доклад. И мой вопрос связан с 2 аспектами, а именно с вашим призывом поделиться идеями по поводу факторов, влияющих на доверие между принимающим населением и мигрантами. И с тем, что вы как бы вскользь упомянули в своем докладе, что есть факторы политические, которые на это влияют. 15 лет назад у нас было исследование, это не были данные RLMS, это было наше оригинальное исследование, в фокусе которого было толерантное и интолерантное отношение принимающего населения к мигрантам в России. И у нас совершенно четко выходила такая устойчивая корреляция между уровнем доверия мигрантам со стороны принимающего населения и уровнем доверия к государственным структурам, властным структурам, политическим партиям. Задавались ли вы вопросом попробовать это исследовать или исследовали уже, просто в рамках доклада не показали? И мой вопрос скорее любопытный, потому что я сейчас этим не занимаюсь, но очень интересно, сохранилась или изменилась тенденция. Спасибо.
Thank you for the comment. That's a really good point. Well, we haven't checked it. I'm not sure whether in the 26th round of RLMS there are questions on political trust, but yeah, I have to check it. Perhaps there are, but that's definitely worth checking, because that would be an interesting point, and perhaps that can somehow allow us to cover the political factor in a way. Yeah, I will look into it. Thank you for that.
Michael, you have a question, please?
Well, thank you for an interesting report and a good piece of analysis, but we also had a project dedicated to interethnic conflict, and we had some findings which urged me to ask a question about the so-called established groups. What are the established groups? Because in our study, we discovered that the established groups is not a kind of concept that we should use in such a study. For instance, in the city of St. Petersburg, we had Uzbeks who were, very well placed structurally in the St. Petersburg society, but at the same time we had an influx of new Uzbeks. So the old Uzbeks were rather hostile to the new Uzbeks because they thought that they were threatening their position structurally, that they were claiming their position in the social structure. So it's not just the established or not established groups that we should be looking at, but also at the way they are structurally positioned. What would you think about that?
Well, in terms of structural positions, that actually goes back to, I think, to what I said about ethnic hierarchies, so that they might potentially influence this relationship. But I'm not sure whether I got your comment right, question right. You mean the attitudes of old Uzbeks to new Uzbeks, right?
Yes, it's the attitude of old Uzbeks to new Uzbeks, but the old Uzbeks had the advantage of being very well placed in the local structure, in the local markets. They had their own private enterprises. They had good jobs that were paying well, and so they had lots of structural advantages. So they were already very well integrated into local society structurally, economically, and that gave them the advantage, and that made them hostile to the influx of new migrants who were not so well established. So the difference between them was not that they were both migrants, both of these groups of migrants, but the old Uzbeks were already part of the local structure.
Yeah, okay, I got it. Well, actually, our distinction into established and recent is, of course, in a way, a bit arbitrarily. I mean that we chosen this one point in time, namely in 1989, as a reference point, and we, in a way, arbitrarily decided that this time frame, so 20 years, would be a threshold in order to separate parts of groups into established and recent. But of course, any threshold you would choose would be in a way arbitrary. So you just have to decide for one. We might have chosen also 1971, but I guess actually the results would be similar because those ethnic fractionalization indices for different time points from the Soviet censuses were very strongly correlated with one another. And so that was actually our idea, that if there is a group, let's say those Uzbeks, right, in a region, then we try to split the group size into those two parts. So we look how large the Uzbeks population 20 years ago was, and we look that, okay, right now we've got 5 times more, so 4/5 would be like new, recent, and 1/5 would be old. Yeah, but anyway, then you put it into an ethnic fractionalization index, which actually is in a way blind to what kind of group you had, and then you in a way a bit lose those nuances, I guess. But we tried to make it more you know, more refined way than just take the simple ethnic fractalization index for 2010. So it was a kind of an attempt. Whether it was successful or not, I mean, the correlation between those two is really is quite strong. So probably and it's because of that naturally population census is not really good at capturing recent migrants. So even those little changes that we introduced by separating these migrant groups into older and younger, let's say, hasn't changed much in the end when you take the
Thank you. Thank you, Zuzanna. Thank you for question. Will, do you have a question? Yes. Very short, please, because we have to proceed. We're hearing.
Yes, quick question for Zuzanna. Thank you for your presentation. Given how you just described how you calculated the new immigrant rate, it seems to me you might be picking up, instead of immigration, you might be picking up just differences in birth rates among across ethnic groups within the population. Is that possible? You're not picking up immigrants and not differences. Maybe Uzbeks in St. Petersburg are just having more children.
Yes, that's right. So that is something that actually is mixed with in this assumption. I mean, it's not even about Uzbeks in St. Petersburg, but just differences between different ethnic groups. So if we look at the difference in the group size between two time points, we in a way used a simplification that we assumed that it's due to immigration, right? But of course, that's also differences between different ethnic groups in terms of total fertility rate and mortality rate. But we are not accounting for it, assuming that, so it's a kind of a simplification, and we are not accounted for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go ahead. And our next presenter is Pavel Jelnov. And I'd like to say that I am always pleasantly surprised how people can find a different focus and different approach to the data set which we are using all together. So his presentation will touch on time and crime and perception of change. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Polina. Thank you very much. So my name is Pavel Jelnov. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Leibniz University, Hannover in Germany, although currently I'm talking from Israel. Моя презентация на английском языке, но можно потом задавать вопросы на русском. С удовольствием отвечу. So, my paper is about the effect of time zone changes, so changes in sunrise and sunset times on crime, on fear of crime, and on related behavior. And part of this question is how long this effect persists, even when the actual effect on crime is over. So I'm motivated by the recent growing interest in the effect of environmental variables on society. So we all live in the period of growing awareness of environmental problems. Climate crisis is a long-term problem. COVID-19 is hopefully a short-term problem, but for sure, long and short-term shocks will have effects which are not only short, but also long-term. So the first question is, what is the effect of a shock, of an environmental shock? This is the most general question. And the second question is, how long survives perception of change, even when some underlying effects disappear over time? So the context in which I analyze this question is the time zones in Russia. Russia has 11 time zones, and this is a time institute. So there are time institutes which exist for 100 years, 120 years, more or less. Time zones and daylight saving time, they are variable around the world. For instance, the European Union decided to stop its daylight saving time transitions just recently. In Russia, we have 11 time zones, and differently from other places, we have very frequent reforms that shift the boundaries of the time zones, generating variation in the sunrise and sunset times. So this research has hopefully three contributions. One is that it is the first use of a natural experiment to assess not only the immediate, but also the long-run effect of daylight on crime, which is specific to this literature on crime. It is also, the second contribution is that it also assesses the behavioral effects on fear of crime and related behavior. And in particular, I utilize the RLMS question about how safe do you feel to walk in your neighborhood in darkness. So, okay, now the logical question is what it has to do with darkness. I mean, even if I shift the sunset 1 hour later, darkness is darkness. But the results show that it has indeed a strong and permanent effect on the share of individuals who report that they feel safe to walk in darkness in their neighborhood of residence. And of course, the more general is the contribution to this literature on the relationship between environment and society. My main findings is that, so first of all, I analyzed, in line with the existing literature, I analyzed the variable of robbery. So a permanent switch to a later sunset leads to a 2-year-long decrease in robbery. This is my main finding. And after 2 years, the robbery returns to its pre-reform level. So in the long run, however, and I'm talking about 10-year perspective, women still report increased propensity to feel safe to walk in darkness, especially in big cities and large settlements. I also find effects on actual walking. So when people report how many minutes they walk every day for men and for women, and I find some reduction in sleep for women, which indicates increase in other activities, in particular outside activities, when the sunset is later. Somewhat surprisingly for me personally, I did not find any effect on alcohol consumption, even when I checked not only RLMS, but also other data such as Rostat data on alcohol sales. In comparison to previous literature, so there is a bunch of papers that estimate the effect of daylight on robbery. For some reason, all of these papers investigate countries in the Western Hemisphere, United States and Latin America, and my results are comparable to theirs. However, all this literature actually uses the daylight saving time transitions as the quasi-experimental setup in a regression discontinuity design. So the effects are on a very short term. Now, in my case, I find similar results, which means that I find a decrease of 14–18% in robbery, but I also find that it persists for 2 years. Now, if you look at Russia, so today the time zones look like this. If we go back in time, we see changes, and we see that some regions of Russia are experiencing, I will run again forward and then backward, so you can see how it changes. And you can see how the several regions are experiencing frequent time reforms. And if you look, after you control, let's say, for time and year fixed effects, so after you really isolate the regions that are exposed to these special reforms, which are not common to all of Russia, you see that these regions include the region on the border between European and Asian part of Russia around Samara. So this Volga River, especially its northern part, Samara, Udmurtia, these provinces, these provinces are experiencing frequent time reforms, probably because they are affected by Moscow, but they are too far away. So there is a trade-off between natural time, which is let's say out of Moscow time zone, and the political and economic pressure from Moscow, which brings them back to the Moscow time, and this trade-off generates these cycles of reforms. We also have the region around Novosibirsk, places which are dependent by Novosibirsk economically. We have the Far East, and we have also Kaliningrad, so the two extreme edges where again we have more trade-off between centralization and nature. And also Crimea was experiencing a shift of 2 time zones after it was annexed. Now, so if we look at average time, so after we've smoothed the transitions to summertime, yes, after we smooth it, we look at annual average, we still observe these fluctuations in, here are examples of these special provinces, Altai, Novosibirsk, Tomsk, Udmurtia. You see these fluctuations of the time zone that generate this variation in the sunrise and sunset times that I utilize. Sorry, I made 2 clicks. So in this paper, I performed 2 pieces of empirical analysis. First, I use Rosstat aggregate data to estimate the effect of daylight on robbery, data from Region RSE, starting from 1990, and here I find the actual effect on robbery. And then I use the RLMS to estimate the effect on fear of crime and related behavior. So in terms of econometric model, my treatment variable is the time. So this T variable is time relatively to Greenwich, normalized by a difference from time in Moscow, and normalized by difference from time in Moscow at some initial point. So the initial point that I take is January 1st, 1980. And the reason for that is that, first of all, my Rosstat data starts in 1990 and the RLMS data starts in 1994. So there is no reason to go more than 10 years before that. And the second reason is that before 1990, the reforms were not that frequent. So most of the reforms start in late 1980s. So this is a difference in differences, basically, treatment variable, which I assume is exogenous after I control for all relevant fixed effects. And for this treatment variable, I take an annual average, which I use to analyze the aggregate data. And I also take the 10 years moving average with respect to the date of RLMS interview. So for instance, if today we are on 29th of May 2021, we can have a look at 10 years starting from 1st of June 2011, and we look at the moving average of this treatment variable. So the first piece of analysis is using Rosstat data, aggregate robbery on province level. Here I have a leads and lags model similar to event studies. So I have 3 leads and 10 lags, and you see this basically this statistically significant negative effect on robbery 1 and 2 years after a reform. So after we've shifted to a later sunset time, so the treatment variable increased. And we also see that it returns to 0 afterwards. So this is the effect on the actual robbery from Rosstat data. Now, from the RLMS, I look at this question. Imagine that you are walking alone in darkness in your neighborhood of residence. How safe do you feel in such a situation? And therefore, answers to this question: not safe at all, not safe, somewhat safe, very safe. And then I have this multinomial logit model where I have the treatment variable on the day of interview and the 10 years moving average. So the reason not to consider leads and lags model like in the aggregate data is that for the individual data, there is no leads and lags. It's collected on arbitrary dates. So and it's also what is done in literature. You generally consider literature, for instance, on climate change. Yes, you consider weather and you consider the moving average weather. So I look at 10 years moving average and all the relevant fixed effect, including this month fixed effect, which is like the seasonal fixed effect. And now I find that basically the effect on this variable is here in this moving average. So the 10 years moving average, we look at women and we see that here are marginal effects, so the probabilities basically. And we see that the effect to report feeling safe increases by 25 percentage points for women at the expense of feeling not safe, not for men. Now I decompose it by European and Asian provinces. So I have 4 treated provinces in European part of Russia, 4 treated provinces in Asian part of Russia. And I find that the effects are observed in both parts of the country, but they are much stronger in Asian part. Now, I can speculate why this is the case, but I'm not sure. So basically in Asian part of Russia, the sunset is later. So this effect of the reform is on later hours. And maybe these later hours are more sensitive to crime. So more crimes are committed in late hours, and that's why the effect here is stronger. Now, we can also look at heterogeneity with respect to the size of the place, so line of population, and we see positive correlation, so it positive interaction. So it means that in large settlements, the effect is stronger. And now the second variable that I analyze is the second RLMS variable is the minutes of walking for daily needs. So how many minutes do you walk, excluding exercise? And here we find positive effect. It's a bit hard to distinguish between treatment and moving average. So in the first 2 columns where I have both variables, nothing is significant. But then when I decompose them, I see that something is going on. So I don't distinguish, but I see that something is going on, both for men and for women. And here, especially when I interacted with the size of the population, I see positive effects for men and for women. So I conclude that people indeed walk more, and in large settlements, in large cities, they walk more because the city is large, so the distances are longer. There are also perhaps more entertainment opportunities, and this effect on walking and also the effect on fear that we saw before is stronger in large settlements. And finally, not finally, but almost finally, effect on sleep. So here I find only short-term effect on women, so they sleep 2% less. But the data for sleep is only for 1994, 1995. So only the reforms of the late 80s and early 90s enter this regression. But still I see this negative effect that shows that probably they spend more time on other activities. And finally, no effect on alcohol consumption. I know that I'm out of time, so I go to conclusion. So this study investigates not only temporary, but also permanent effect or long-term effect of daylight on crime, fear of crime, and related behaviors. So in this sense, this paper is pioneering. I explored a long series of time reforms in different Russian regions. Some of them are European, some of them are Asian, and I observed this robustness in terms that in both European and Asian parts of Russia, the effect exists. So there is some external validity here. And I corroborate recent findings from investigation of DST, of daylight saving time transitions in other countries in Americas, and find a similar comparable 12 to 18 percentage points, % effect on robbery 1 and 2 years after the shock, after the clock was set 1 hour forward. Women increase propensity to feel safe. Men and women probably walk more. Women sleep less. So all the effects are going in the direction that we would probably expect. And what is for me interesting is that women feel safe even in darkness. So the general feeling of safety improves. This is, I think, the interesting behavioral finding here. And finally, the bottom line is that environmental factors, in this case daylight, but it may also work for other variables, have permanent behavioral effects which may survive longer than some underlying mechanisms. So in this case, the reduction in robbery is temporary, but it seems that the behavioral effect persists longer than that. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. If you can close your presentation, and as we can see everybody on the screen.
Yes.
And any questions?
So let's see it like this.
Any question? Yes, Yulia, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, data, and idea. Do you consider the effect of white nights in the northern regions of Russia? Regions where the daytime is longer than darkness time for a few months every year, and how can it influence your results?
Yes, so in the treated regions, so the regions that actually generate this variation in the differences treatment variable, do not include, the very far north. So in this sense, the very far north does not contribute to my reform-driven variation. So as I showed on the map, the treated regions are the regions on Volga, around Novosibirsk, and so it's not an RLMS, but it is in Rostov, also far east, and Kaliningrad. So, but I understand this question, and this question, so, okay, I cannot answer it with this data, but I can tell you that there are also papers that investigate, for instance, Scandinavian countries. I'm not aware of papers about crime, but I'm aware of papers about health, how these white nights affect health in Norway, for instance, and they indeed find effects. But as I said, with RLMS data, it's a bit hard to say.
Yeah.
Even COMI is in RLMS, but it does not drive this variation that I exploit.
Okay, thank you. Michael, you have a sign of question. Do you still have a question or just still have a sign on your screen? Oh, no. Who else?
I just have a sign. No.
Okay, okay. So any other questions? No, comments? Ideas? Yeah, please. Will, please.
Thank you, Pavel, for a really interesting presentation, a very convincing presentation too. It seems to me I saw you present an earlier version of this paper a couple of years ago, and I think you've added the RLMS data to the analysis, and I find it all fits together very, very nicely. I was wondering if not with respect to the RLMS, but the Rostov data that you have on robberies, if there are other types of crime that you might not think or wouldn't be sensitive to daylight that you looked at, and did you find that there wasn't an effect, kind of a placebo test, if you will. And also, could you talk a little bit about magnitudes of the effects on crime reduction from the change in daylight hours?
So first of all, with regard to other types of crime, so yes, I estimated also for other types of crime, I did not find effects, and I'm not surprised. First of all, the literature also other papers are very heavily biased toward investigation of robbery with respect to daylight, because this is the type of crime that is probably more than any other type of crime associated with outside meetings between offenders and victims. I think more than homicide, more than rape, because these violent crimes, there are also other crimes, but most of them take place either inside or between people who are familiar with each other, etc. Now, to your question on, you asked about other crimes and you asked about the magnitude. So I actually showed that the magnitude is comparable to what is found for daylight saving time transitions in Western Hemisphere. in Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, United States. So we are talking about around, let's say, 15% decrease in robbery, 15% when we shift the sunset time 1 hour later.
Vladimir, you have a question, please. Microphone.
Yeah, thanks for very interesting presentation. Actually, I have never thought about this effect. So, but I'm thinking how the change in daylight may affect other behavioral outcomes, various outdoor and indoor activities, composition of leisure activities, and so on and so on. Did you look at this, or what do you think? Does it make sense to look at this?
I think it definitely makes sense. I think that I tried to do the best from RLMS data. I think that I tried to do the best because many variables are just not collected during the relevant years. Because, you know, we have time reforms, for instance, in 1994 in Altai, or in 2002 in Tomsk, or in 2009 in Udmurtia. But unfortunately, many variables that seem related are not collected in the relevant periods of time. So I think I try to do the best. It, of course, may happen that I missed some variable that could be analyzed and was collected during the relevant period of time. Of course, yes, the time use here is basically, this question is about time use. Today I heard about this time use 2019 survey that Rostat performed. I did not know about that. So this is a very relevant piece of data, and I just heard about it today in this conference for the first time. So I will try to have a look at that.
You can download immediately.
I will do it.
Okay. More questions? No? Okay. Then we can turn to our third presenter, Mikhail Chernysh. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now trying to launch my presentation, which is entitled Well-Being as Happiness. It's based on the project that we're currently running. And I should like to start with one possible claim, is that in sociology, there are variables that can be well explained by the existing data. But at the same time, there are variables that look quite mysterious, that do not obviously ensue any explanations, immediate explanations or immediate cause and effect models. And one of such variables is the variable of happiness. Happiness is being measured all the time. It has been measured in Russia quite a number of times. And the data that we get when we measure happiness is that the Russian population is basically happy. And this is in spite of the fact that the majority of Russians do believe that their society is unjust. There is a lot of hardship. There is a lot of evidence that shows that the Russian populations, at least quite a number of Russians, live on a shoestring, live hand to mouth, and this is really amazing. That these poor people and people that live in a society that they regard as unjust, that do not trust basic institutions, still believe that they are happy. So what is the origin of happiness? This is one of the problems that we hit upon. And I should like to say one thing that also promoted this question to a high rank is that the variable of happiness is often used for political arguments. It's often said that, well, since the population is happy, that means that the policy is the right one, that we are pursuing the right kind of economic and social policy if this policy makes the population happy. So this is one of the reasons why we address the problem of happiness, and I believe that one of the sources to which we addressed ourselves in order to explore the question of happiness is this study that is very well known across the world, and this is the World Happiness Report. World Happiness Report that has been consistently published on an annual basis. The World Happiness Report reports on a complex variable that fuses objective indicators of various social scales. First of all, it's the life evaluation, the evaluation of life. People evaluate their lives on the basis of a 10-point scale. And then positive emotions that they experienced the day before and negative emotions that they experienced the day before. All of these emotions are added up and make up a variable that is treated as happiness. But what I should like to say that it's not happiness, actually, that they are measuring. When it turned out that Finland is the happiest country in the world, as you see in this arrangement, and Denmark are the happiest countries in the world. I received a phone call from Finland from my colleagues that said, don't believe the data. We are not as happy as the study says.
Михаил, можете пустить презентацию на полный экран? Очень плохо видно. Пишут вам в чате.
Okay, just a moment. Let's see. I believe that since the table, the chart is so big, it's really difficult to make it more detailed. But anyway, it's just a general idea of what it looks like. I mean, the World Happiness Report, and that Finland tops this rating of happy countries, but the Finns themselves do not agree with it, and they say that in most cases, the explanations that are provided by the group that releases this World Happiness Report are not adequate to how they understand happiness and to what happiness can be. So the definitions of happiness are often arbitrary, and this is one of the problems. So this, before we started exploring happiness, we had to conceptualize happiness and and compare it with adjacent concepts such as well-being. Happiness is, we devised happiness the way it is presented in the RLMS survey, which describes subjective emotions that are related to oneself and one's placement in the world. The question is rather direct, is how happy are you? And well-being is defined differently as a variable that spans across subjective and objective circumstances of life. It focuses on individuals and is at some point synonymous with happiness if it's related to one's position in the immediate environment. But well-being goes beyond that immediate environment and involves external circumstances. So I would call the happiness variable is subject to what I would qualify as the Zhivago complex. The complex may be defined as follows. The farther we are from the well-being goes from the circumstance of go from the person, the less the impact of well-being or the circumstances that define the well-being have on subjective happiness. The external circumstances of life may be tragic, may be dramatic, but within the closest perimeter of life, the feeling of happiness may persist. And this is what Dr. Zhivago, as you know from the famous novel, felt when he was in seclusion with his beloved Lara in a small hamlet while the revolution was raging on and the circumstances of societal life were quite dramatic and perhaps tragic. But he was happy, and he was writing poems in that secluded place. So happiness can be understood and conceptualized as something that happens within, as it is defined by the circumstances that can directly affect what is happening inside a human being or inside someone. So implicit in this statement is a divide between an individual and an objective setup of his or her life. So happiness may persevere in the most dire circumstances. One can be happy living in a totalitarian country against the backdrop of food shortages, cramped housing, political instability, whatever happens, but you can still be happy. So and that also, if that assumption is right, that means that we cannot use happiness policies or the policies that are being currently pursued by the authorities. So this is the, but we have to prove that statement. We have to prove that assessment. For that purpose, we use the RLMS data, though we can say that RLMS data cannot provide us with a conclusive result since some of the variables are missing. But nevertheless, in an oblique way, indirectly, it allows us to explore the happiness variable and its dependencies. First of all, we correlated the happiness variable with other variables that describe the subjective evaluation of the respondent in society. And there are several such descriptions. First of all, it's the power happiness scale. The power scale is the 9-point scale on which a person places him or herself. And that shows the way he or she evaluate their place in their ability to influence the things go on in society. Then the recognition scale, the respect scale, which also 9-point, and then the wealth scale and the loneliness scale. Loneliness is perhaps the most personal of all these variables. What we have now you can see the correlations, this Spearman correlation, Ross-Spearman, because all these variables are ordinal, so we use the ordinal correlations coefficient in order to evaluate the way they are connected, they are related to each other. So what we have is that though the correlations between happiness and all these variables are significant, however, the correlations between the power and recognition scales are not that significant. The most significant correlation that this analysis shows is the correlation between happiness and loneliness. If you are lonely, you are not happy. And this is almost tautological because both of these variables describe the subjective feelings, subjective perceptions, while others relate to society. And that shows that what is happening inside oneself, in what is the evaluation of what is happening inside oneself is perhaps more important for the feeling of happiness than what is happening in society and the projection of a person in various hierarchies inside society. That's a possible assumption. We can also see that some of the variables are very closely related to each other, and particularly the power scale and the wealth scale, which is a result which is significant on its own without any reference to to the happiness scale, because since wealth and power are so related in Russia, that's also an indicator of how the social structures work in the Russian society. So we further started the exploration of happiness with the variables that describe objective placement of a person in society. For that case, we used the ordinal regression and equation, and within that we matched the happiness variables against the usual set of demographic variables such as age, marital status, and employment. And what we see that employment doesn't have any particular effect, or the place in the employment or no employment, the location inside the employment structure doesn't have any evident and obvious effect on the feeling of happiness. Marital status does have an obvious effect, and particularly being married has an obvious effect, but also being unmarried has a positive effect. If you are unmarried, in some cases, it's also an important and positive factor that leads us to being happy. So both these statuses have an impact. Age, there is an obvious dependency here, is that age, the younger you are, the happier you are. But that's obvious. That's kind of obvious influence on that. But gender doesn't have any particularly or significant influence on happiness. So this, in fact, this analysis shows that that there are indirectly shows us that the personal placement is more important than something that's defined by society. The reflection of societal structures on personal placement is more important than anything there, than other things. And then we measured the happiness variable. We placed it against a number of other variables that were supposed or were assumed to might have some influence on the feeling of scale. And what we see here is that religiosity doesn't have much impact on scale. In most cases, I mean mild religiosity, only in the case when people are very religious. If they are very religious, that does have an obvious impact on their happiness. Then self-evaluation of the state of health, that has a lot of influence on being happy. As we see here, that's the health as a personal variable, some variable that describes personal suffering or personal misplacement is something that is also quite important. And the loneliness scale, as I have already said, is an important description. And then the change in material being has a very moderate effect on the happiness. Then security in the place of residence doesn't have any significant effect on the happiness. That is to say, but that's part of well-being, obviously. If someone is living in a city or in a village and which is unsafe, that should have an effect on well-being, but it has an effect on well-being perhaps, but not on the feeling of happiness. And then trusting other people doesn't have any significant effect on happiness, on personal happiness. So these are the basic data that we have that lead us to further speculate on the nature of happiness and its effect on human life and its possible definition, and it's possible as a concept that we might use in further study. So our conclusion is that happiness is a product of the closest environment. It's generated by very close interactions within families, its location within that close circle of friends and relatives, and personal status as far as health is concerned. Social indicators of well-being that are used by Jeffrey Sachs and others in the World Happiness Report do not actually relate to happiness. So the evaluation of corruption, political or economic instability can affect the state of happiness only if they penetrate within the internal willings and dealings of human life, of individual life. And with that, I'd like to conclude my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Colleagues, questions? If you can close your presentation, close your screen. Thank you. Questions? Comments? No questions. Okay. Once again, no. Okay. If no one has questions, I think we should proceed. And I would like to invite Arina Rodina as our fourth presenter. Arina, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
So good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to present you a paper about the initial effects of Russian pension reform. So in most industrialized countries, population aging and increased life expectancy generate additional pressure, fiscal pressure on pension systems, and Russia was no exception. But for many years, the retirement age in Russia remained unchanged. It was 60 years for men and 55 years for women. But in mid-2018, the Russian authorities announced an increase in retirement age by 5 years, from 60 to 65 for men and from 55 to 60 for women, starting from January 2019. However, in June 2018, when this reform was initially announced, around 89% of respondents had a negative attitude towards this proposal. So what could be the potential reason behind such a resentment? The first one stems from the fact that many individuals in the pre-retirement age might have had different plans outside the labor force, and health-related employability constraints could be one of them. And the second reason, probably most important one, is that since Russian legislation allows working beyond retirement age and thus receiving both wage and pension benefits, the shift of retirement age by 5 years is tantamount to taking 60 monthly pensions from workers' wallets. So this income shock could be especially sensitive for those who planned to continue working after retirement age and to receive a stable earnings. All these reasons could have amplified the feelings of uncertainty and undermined the confidence in the future. And at the time of writing this paper, too little time has passed to evaluate the effects of a pension reform on labor market outcomes, on patterns of saving and consumption, or on health behaviors. However, such parameters as psychological impacts or sentiments didn't need much time to emerge. So we can evaluate the causal effects, which are reflected in sentiments and in subjective well-being for various categories of population, and especially for those at pre-retirement age. So these parameters of subjective well-being and economic sentiment, they are very closely related, and they generally describe the person's attitudes towards the current situation in country and the personal situation overall and financial situation, and person's expectations about the future life in the country. So there is a wide literature on the effects of the increase in retirement age on labor market outcomes. I'm not going to talk in detail about it here, but it generally shows that it improves employment and reduces the hiring of younger workers. And there's also literature on subjective well-being. And what's most important is the literature that shows that people who have retired earlier or later than they have expected, for them, this shock is negative, and they experience negative shock on subjective well-being, on mental well-being, and also on job satisfaction and job motivation. However, the question of how the unexpected increase in retirement age affects economic sentiment and subjective well-being still remains underexplored. And since we have this pension policy, which is exogenous, it could be considered as a natural experiment, allowing for identification of causal impacts. And the main assumption that we make is that individuals who were close to retirement threshold before the policy were most exposed to this treatment. And we want to test whether their subjective well-being and economic sentiment parameters were affected differently compared to people from the control group or current retirees. So the main hypothesis is that this unexpected increase in retirement age negatively affected the parameters of economic sentiment and subjective well-being for people close to retirement. For this, we use two sources of data. The first one is RLMS data, and we use individual data from 2012 to 2019, and the treatment threshold is outlined as the year 2018. That's very convenient because the beginning of the polls for 2018 RLMS were in October, and October 2018 is exactly the month when this law was officially adopted. So that's why we can say that the year 2018 is the first year after the treatment. So the post-treatment period is years 18-19. The second data set is the Levada Center data set, and it has certain limitations because it's monthly cross-sectional data, and we would like to work with panel data. So we need to create a synthetic panel. We do this by grouping individuals by their year of birth with a 5-year step and calculating the monthly average for each of these groups, men and women separately. And we meet all the valid criteria for the construction of synthetic panel. The most important one is that we need to approximate around 100 observations per cohort. We meet this criteria because on average, we approximate around 150 or 60 observations per one cohort. So these are the questions that we choose from both data sets. They generally describe economic sentiment and subjective well-being of individuals, and they refer to the assessment of the life, of the current life in the country, of the future life in the country, of the current economic situation in the country, and the future economic situation in the country, and the expectations of the future life in the next year. And here's a short notice of description statistics. What needs to be mentioned is that the statistics for Levada Center are presented here before the approximation. So after the approximation, this minimum and maximum values will be non-integer numbers. So the question arises, did the policy affect all individuals equally, and which people could be referred to the treatment group and which to the control group? So we assume that people who were before close to retirement age referred to a treatment group, and we choose a 15-year corridor. So we take people who were first affected by the policy and then take a 15-year before that. However, we exclude this year, this line, because the retirement age for people here increased only for half a year. So we exclude these individuals and take the 15-year corridor. And for control group, we apply the same symmetrical corridor for current retirees. So this will be men from 60 to 74 and women from 55 to 69. So we have two symmetrical groups around the reference point of the first people who were affected by the policy, excluding these individuals. For this, we use two methods. The first one is difference in differences method. We estimate the following equation, and this beta-3 coefficient before the interaction variable. So there is a dummy for treatment, a dummy for the group interaction between them, and the coefficient before this interaction exactly tells the effect of the policy. And the main assumption for this method is the parallel trends assumption. So for the variables that did not have this parallel trends before the policy, we apply the synthetic control method. So the synthetic control method, it also evaluates the causal effect, but it works a bit differently. So it usually applies when there is a specified treatment group, but the researcher doesn't know which control group is the right one. So using weights, we need to create a synthetic control group out of a pool of control groups. And this method is mostly graphical. So what we need to see in the graph is that two lines before the treatment should perfectly align. They should be similar. And the lines after the treatment should diverge. And this difference in the lines after the treatment, or the divergence itself, is the effect of the policy. And there is also this parameter, root mean square percentage error, which shows how accurately we find this weight so that they represent the treatment group before the intervention. So we need to minimize this parameter in order to find the correct weight. So for this method, the treatment group remains as it was, and for control group, we take all the other individuals remaining and we group them with a 5-year step. So what we have around 11 different groups of people, and these are our pool of control groups. And then we use this weight and create a synthetic control group out of this pool of control groups. So let's go to results now. First, I presented results for baseline results for using the RLMS dataset, using the difference in differences method. So out of 5 variables from this dataset, we analyze only 4 here, these 2 ones, and this one's only from the year 2014, because other variables do not satisfy the parallel trends assumption that is crucial for difference in differences method. So we can conclude that people close to retirement age, due to the increase in retirement age, they increase their fear of not being able to provide necessities, and they also decrease their perception of their future life. So here we can see results of a negative economic sentiment on our treated group. Next, the synthetic control method for the variables from the RLMS dataset. So these are variables that did not satisfy the parallel trend, assumption. So for example, let's look at the life satisfaction. Here, the solid line represents the treatment group, and the dashed line represents the control group. So we need to use weights so that the 2 lines perfectly align before the intervention, and their divergence after intervention exactly tells us the effect. So here we can see the negative effect for the treated individuals. And here results are almost the same. So for the control group, the results will go down. So people will decrease their fear of losing job, but for the treatment group, it remains the same. And this huge divergence between the results tells us the negative effect for the treatment group. And also for life satisfaction with material status, it follows the same pattern. So we can also see here that for the control group, it would go up, but for the treatment group, it goes down. And there is also a difference between these parameters. And lastly, the results from the Levada Center dataset. We used only difference in differences method in this case because all of the results had parallel trends before the intervention. So we can conclude that people close to retirement age, due to the increase in retirement age, decreased their perception of the current situation in the country, also decreased their trust and approval of the actions by the President Vladimir Putin, also decreased their expectations about economic situation in Russia in the next year, decreased their perception of the current economic situation in Russia, and also decreased their evaluation of their future life in the country. So I would also like to briefly talk about the robustness checks. We conducted 3 robustness checks. First, we changed the time window of the pre-treatment period. So we changed the first year of our analysis. Secondly, we conducted placebo tests for a fake treatment group, as if the real treatment group is not people close to retirement age, but young individuals. And our results are robust. And for the third method, we used this only for variables for which we use the synthetic control method. It's a backdating test. So we reassigned the treatment to occur in the year 2015, as if the treatment was not here, but it was here. And if we see no divergence of the lines after that, that means that there is no intervention. So all of our results are robust to this specification. So in conclusion, we can summarize that due to the increase in retirement age, people close to the retirement threshold has experienced a lower evaluation of the quality of life in Russia, current and future, decreased life satisfaction, lower assessment of the overall situation in the country, increased fear of losing job and not being able to provide necessity, decreased approval of the policy actions by the president, and decreased confidence in the current future economic situation in the country. So there are several mechanisms behind each of these results. I'm not going to elaborate on this right now, but the global mechanism is that the need to adjust to this unanticipated shock. Why was it unanticipated? Because the policy was announced in June 2018. It was officially adopted in October 2019, and the rules were entering the force already in January 2018. So because people needed to adjust their life to this unanticipated shock, this resulted in a significant negative influence on economic sentiment and subjective well-being parameters of people close to retirement threshold. So in comparison to other studies which analyze the effects of retirement, we show the causal relationship between this exogenous shock in retirement expectations and subjective well-being. And also, what needs to be noticed is that we examine versatile characteristics of economic sentiment and subjective well-being by using 2 data sets and by using overall 12 different variables. So in the end, I would like to notice that this decline in economic sentiment can signal distrust and unfairness in the government's action, and it should raise awareness and enhance focus on the socioeconomic needs of elderly individuals. And the future research can be fruitfully extended to detect the consequences of this policy on labor market, job motivation, and health behavior. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Arina. Okay, colleagues, questions? No questions. Michael, please.
Well, I think that thank you for a very good report and for the way you tested the data, which shows a lot of reliability in the data that you are presenting to us. But there is one question that I think nags at me is that what about the general backdrop against which the reform was taking place? I mean, the stagnant economy, decreased living standards, in comparison with, let's say, what happened in early aughts, from the year of 2000 to 2008, which was economic growth, etc. So the general backdrop, do you think it has an effect? Because there may be hypothesized that the economic growth, if it happened, would mollify the effect of the reform on the minds of those who are subject to the reforms. What would you say?
Okay, thank you for your question. Of course, the overall background also might have an effect, and it also matters. But what we try to do here, we try to disentangle exactly the effect of this pension policy on these parameters. So the empirical methods that we use allow us to do that. So here we assess only the effect of the sole pension policy on the examined variables.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, would somebody?
I have a question. I have a comment.
Yes, please, Rodina.
I think it's an excellent study, and it's a very rare case when we have quasi-experimental
natural
events that we can use for deriving causality, causal effects. And I think Arina, using 2 different methods and 2 different data sets and making different robustness checks, shows this quite convincingly. And I think that thinking about, well, back about this particular case, about introduction of pension reform, we can find many more implications which can be explored using RLMS data. So I think in this sense, she shows the way where other RLMS users can move and benefit from the data and exploit the idea presented in this work, in this study. So that's my general comment, more on the approach than on a particular presentation. But I was involved in, in discussing that, so I don't want to go into particular comments.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else? No. Okay. Probably this is the end of Saturday working day and people are a little bit exhausted. But let me say, first of all, that on behalf of RLMS team, I'd like to thank you all for first using the data, which we've been producing for more than 25 years now. And it's so exciting to see how much can be done and is done based on this unique data set. And thank you for joining the conference. I hope it was important and it was useful and interesting for all of you. And we look forward for new conferences. It would be very important for us to get your feedback in many regards. First of all, we would like to hear what kind of additional data, like longitudinal, like unique IDs or ID members IDs file, which was placed not long ago on the website. What can we do to make the data set more friendly? We are trying, but you're using the data and it's very important to have this feedback. Second, we would like to know what kind of like workshops or master classes or video would be useful to put on the website to help you better understand the overall construction of the data set, the possibility which it provides. Because again, every time, every conference, every publication brings some fantastic, amazing results. I mean, amazing ideas of about how the data can be used. It's really a very, very rich data set. And the third point, which I see Michael Kosalapov is looking at me right now, but I would say that we cannot promise that we would add questions to the RLMS next rounds without funding, but still we would be very much interested in getting the idea what kind of variables should be added. Very small number should be added and can be added to make the analysis of yours more interesting and more publishing. And so you're welcome to come up with ideas. Again, we can't promise because the questionnaire, as you know, is already very, very long, and we can't put such a burden on our poor respondents who have been so good keeping participation in this survey. So once again, thank you all very much, and we look forward to new conferences, to new meetings, hopefully offline in 2 years, or maybe in a mixed type, like it's very often these days, like some of us would be meeting in Moscow and others would be online. Any other comments, any other words?
I'd like to thank everybody for inspiring comments.
Thanks. Okay, so have a nice evening and productive next week and nice Sunday. And see you all. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.